How to invent a religion.
I always knew you had to be willing to die to even do this job.
You can't stop what's coming. Executive orders.
The creation and the maintenance of a secret government within our government.
Is something wrong? With what? With anything?
I feel like you want to rip your face off.
There's something wrong with everything.
I was so spun.
What's the most you ever lost in a coin toss?
The law of the jungle, sir.
The most you ever lost in a coin toss?
You don't know what you're talking about. Who'd say?
I said, you don't know what you're talking about.
Suppression of unrest and dissent. Domestic anti-terrorism.
I don't have some way to put it. That's the way it is.
Hello, everybody. It's going down tonight. Fetzer, Rumble over to Rubble, live right here on revisionmedia.org. It is April the 2nd, and there will be blood tonight. We have connecting with us Dr. Jim Fetzer, co-founder or founder of Scholars for 9/11 Truth, and co-chair. Jim Fetzer, how are you doing tonight, sir?
Terrific, Rollie. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. I'm very glad that you're actually giving me a platform. You know, you're a rock star in my opinion, Jim, and I'm very privileged to have you on my show.
Well, I'm delighted to be here and glad we could put this together.
Jimbo, what a delight.
Joe, is that you, my friend?
And we have Joe Olson with us. Joel, can you say hello to the audience for us?
Hi, folks. We're ready for some truth. Let's rock and roll.
We got, of course, with us Steve Dayock, who's on the other side. But, of course, we're all on the same side ultimately. Steve, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Rollie. How are you doing?
I'm very good. And this is Steve Dayock from 9/11 Crash Test. Can you tell the folks about your site?
Yeah, 9/11 Crash Test was an idea I had, sort of a ripoff of the Mythbusters idea where they cut a car in half with a rocket sled. And the idea is to mount a wing from a 767 on a rocket sled and collide it at 550 miles per hour with some steel box columns built to the same specifications as the World Trade Center. And then film it all with high-speed cameras and see what happens.
Thank you very much for that plug for your own website. And tonight we're going to have a 6-part battle royale. We're going to have a battle royale tonight. It's going to be a 6-part series. Part number 1 is going to be an overview, and it's going to be a general interpretation about the events of 9/11, and each party is going to have 5 minutes to say their general interpretation. If Phil doesn't come on, we're going to have Team Fetzer give about 10 minutes, and then Steve is going to counter that or give his interpretation in 10 minutes as well. And then part 2, we're going to talk about Shanksville. And then part 3, we're going to get into the Pentagon, what happened that day. And then part 4, we're going to get into planes in New York. And part 5, we're going to talk about how the World Trade Centers were destroyed. There were multiple of them. And part 6, we're going to get into the rebuttals. And it's going to flow like this. It's going to be Jim first, and then it's going to be followed by Steve Dayock. And there's a 30-second minute warning before the bell. And I got a boxer timing tonight. This is the warning right here. So if you hear that, that means you got a 30-second warning. And this is the bell for the end of your round. This person's going to flow in into his discussion. Is there something funny? Yeah, okay.
Very nice. I think I might have a delay on here.
Okay, no problem. Shall we get into it, gentlemen? I'm going to start the timer for Jim Fetzer to give a general overview of what happened during 9/11. Okay, so first we got Jim Fetzer. He's going to give an interview, or he's going to give an overview of the general interpretation of the events of 9/11. Are you ready to start, Jim? Are you clear on the rules?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I should have mentioned that. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Jim.
9/11 was a classic false flag operation intended to create the false impression that 19 Islamic terrorists had attacked the United States when it was orchestrated by the CIA, the neocons in the Department of Defense, and the Mossad. The objective was a public relations stunt to make the public believe that foreign players had brought about these atrocities, which turns out to be correct, except they were not the 19 Islamic terrorists, but Israeli terrorists instead. The point was to fabricate a pretext for the U.S. to become engaged in the Middle East, to take out the modern Arab states that served as a counterbalance to Israel's domination of the entire region, and eventually to confront the Persian nation of Iran. The 9/11 Commission report, like the Warren report before it, was completely fabricated and relied upon false witnesses, fabricated phone calls, contrived videos, and a fantastic story of an attack orchestrated by Osama bin Laden, who had nothing to do with it and was, in fact, our man in Afghanistan, instrumental in getting Stinger missiles into the hands of the Mujahideen, which they used to shoot down Soviet choppers and planes. He was an officer in the CIA, Colonel Tim Osman, and was even visited by a representative of the agency at a hospital in Dubai shortly before his death from his physical maladies in Afghanistan on 15 December 2001. On 26 December, both CNN and Fox would report his death. Barack Obama, however, would find it politically expedient to resurrect Osama and have him die a second time during a fake raid on that compound in Pakistan. Like everything else the 9/11 Commission told us, it was complete poppycock. The planning of the event, as I surmise, was done by the man who would become the executive director of the inquiry, Philip Zelikow, whose specialization in the academy before entering government service was the creation and maintenance of public myths, which was what we got about 9/11. It distresses me that he is ensconced in the Department of History at the University of Virginia, where I taught twice. But my own experience with the department suggests that its members have no interest in getting history right, whether that would be about 9/11 or even Charlottesville itself. None of the four planes crashed on 9/11, and the Twin Towers did not collapse. The calls from passengers were faked, and the attack on the Pentagon was completely contrived to say that the U.S. Command and Control Center had been attacked, which made it an act of war. As we proceed tonight, you will learn what really happened as opposed to the mass illusion. A key feature of the events that brought us 9/11 was the Port Authority's transfer of the World Trade Center into private hands just 6 weeks prior, where the new owner, Larry Silverstein, happens to be a personal friend of Bibi Netanyahu, in whose fertile mind the entire project appears to have originated. We, the people, must understand what happened to ensure we are not played again by our false friends in the Middle East. We may agree on most of what I have outlined here, but I am sure our differences will prove to be as interesting and potentially illuminating as our areas of agreement. Pay special attention to purported violations of laws of physics, of engineering, and of aerodynamics, which cannot be violated and cannot be changed. When you are told of alleged causes, but their expected effects are not present, that's a tell that you are being misled. Would it were not the case, but what I've already said about the origins of the attacks and who was responsible does not come from A&E 9/11 or Judy Wood and her Dews associates, who are also unreliable concerning how it was done, much less who and why. Thanks to each of you for participating tonight, and to Rollie for taking the pains to arrange a Rubble a rumble over the rubble. I hold Steve in high esteem and am glad that Phil and Joe are here to support us, where Joe is a civil and structural engineer in whom I have great confidence. That concludes my opening statement.
Joe, you got 5 minutes and 20 seconds. Do you want
Oh, sure. Yeah, as mentioned in our preamble when we were discussing in the green room, I'm a registered engineer, 35 years, trained in structural engineering, have worked in high-rise buildings in 20 different states, hundreds of structures. I attended the Architects and Engineers for 911 Truth DVD premiere in Austin in May of 2009. It was a 4-hour-long presentation with Alex Jones and Richard Gage. I reviewed the material that they brought, including the stamped approved structural steel plans for World Trade Center 1 and 2, which are identical buildings, and World Trade Center 7. I was convinced it was controlled demolition, but I was also aware of the volume of explosives that it would take to do that level of controlled demolition and the amount of pre-planning that it would take. And so I never accepted the thermite hypothesis. Richard Gage came to Houston for 2 additional DVD premieres, and I went and had dinner with him after the DVD presentations, which were 2-hour DVDs with an hour-long discussion. He let me speak at both of those presentations here in town. We had dinner afterwards. I've had hundreds of emails with him. I support a lot of what they do. I've watched their finite element analysis of the failure of Building 7, which was done by Professor Hawley of University of Alaska Fairbanks, civil engineering professor. I agree 100% with what he said in that particular video. I neglected to do much study on the Pentagon because it was an obvious missile strike, and it didn't involve the loss of life and the catastrophic failure that the World Trade Center buildings did. And I neglected to spend any time studying Shanksville. So my area of expertise on this particular debate is strictly the 2 World Trade Center buildings, which I have studied at least 2 hours a week for the last 10 years. So that's over 1,000 hours of engineering research into those particular projects, and I'm very, very familiar with the material. In December of 2016, Richard Gage made a presentation to the Nation of Islam in Detroit at a conference where he sat side by side at the conference table with presentations by Christopher Bolin, who I met at the Austin Truth Fest on the 15th anniversary of 911, September 11th of 2016. And he also was there with Kevin Barrett, who's one of the editors with Veterans Today, who's been presenting the most material on nuclear demolition. And when he agreed to do that, I agreed to be one of the 3,000 engineers that had signed his Architects and Engineers petition. So I did that in December of 2016 after 7 years of waiting for them to, 7 years of waiting for them to actually address the how the buildings could have been done other than thermite, and the who, which 911 group has never addressed. So I was asked by Robert David Steele to present a memo to the president, which was done in July of 2018, and they were collated with 28 other memos, including one by Steve Dieck, and those were submitted to the White House in August. They've had over 1 million views. I printed laminated color copies of those and took them to the MAGA Trump rally here in Houston on October 22nd of 2018. I got there at 10 o'clock in the morning. There was over 2,000 people in line. The line snaked back and forth as it was winding towards the Toyota Summit, where the actual 18,000 people were allowed to go in. And I talked to several hundred people, showing them colored copies of the World Trade Center buildings and explaining the nuclear demolition. And out of all the people I talked to, I had 3 people that said, I don't want to believe that. Everybody else was like, oh my God, asking questions, taking their cell phones out, shooting copies of the URL so they could go look the stuff up themselves, coming up to me as the line snaked back and forth and saying, I went and read your stuff online. Man, that's really incredible. Thank you so much. It was like veterans and law enforcement officers, the whole spectrum. So bottom line is the material, nobody believes the 911 Commission. So that's what we all have in common. And I don't think there's actually going to be a whole lot of separation between us as far as the material. I know Steve has studied more on Shanksville and the Pentagon than I have, and I know Jim is far more studied on those two. So they can have the floor for that particular discussion. But if the discussion is WTC 1 and 2, I'm there. So I'll be more than happy to explain anything. Thank you so much.
Okay. Is it my turn?
Yeah, your turn right now. Go ahead.
Okay. Greetings, everyone. Everyone knows the best way to control the opposition is by leading it. Therefore, the leading hypotheses of the truth movement should be given extra scrutiny. We have the nuke camp, the directed energy weapons camp, the planes were reinforced camp, the everything was fake camp, and there's also the official story camp and the Jews did it camp, and so on and so forth. The 9/11 truth movement is an example of a completely divided and conquered opposition group, if ever there was one. And I shouldn't need to say this, but not all of these hypotheses can be correct. There can be only one right answer, which means most of us are wrong. So how do we truthers arrive at the truth in the face of so much apparent untruth? Simple. Ask yourself what evidence these leading opposition groups, most of which are wrong, have been avoiding, and you'll find almost without exception that they skip the first step in any criminal investigation to examine and to attempt to reconstruct the evidence at the scene of the crime. In this case, the crash sites. Reconstructing the crime scene is a critical step because it limits the possibilities of the series of events that occurred which resulted in the evidence as found. That's what I mean by there can be only one right answer, because there was only one series of events that resulted in the holes in the Twin Towers, and that resulted in that odd-shaped crater in Shanksville, and that resulted in the damage to the Pentagon. After determining what the most likely series of events was, to discover who the most likely suspects are, one must determine who had the means, motive, and opportunity to make it happen. What you're left with is the truth. This evidence very quickly leads to the conclusion that all the videos of the plane crashes are fraudulent, and that they were used as video layer masks to disguise the real means used to cut the holes in the towers. As outrageous as it may sound, according to the evidence we all have access to, multiple cruise missiles were launched in broad daylight against targets within the USA. Considering the U.S. military has the planet's largest arsenal of cruise missiles, that they were tasked with protecting the America's airspace, and that they have been invading the world ever since this occurred, the U.S. military should be at the top of the suspect list. This list should also include the people behind the inception, planning, and construction of the World Trade Center, with special focus on people like David and Nelson Rockefeller, Larry Silverstein, and the fellows within the hyper-corrupt Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, as well as the contractors involved. In doing so, it can be seen that none of the official reasons that were given for the necessity of building the World Trade Center stand up to scrutiny, and in actuality, the World Trade Center was shrouded in corruption, disinformation, and secrecy since it was just a gleam in David Rockefeller's all-seeing eye. The World Trade Center was built and operated for 30 years by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which is not subject to the inspections of either state it has authority over, and only answers to two people on the planet, the governors of New York and New Jersey. So we have this quasi-governmental body that does not report to the public, which is run like a private business with debt capacity comparable to government agencies, that can seize property through eminent domain, with a monopoly over one of the largest ports in the world, and which consistently makes headlines for its non-transparent environment of corruption. I mean, come on, who runs the docks in every gangster movie ever made? Right. And these are the people that we are trusting to bring us the truth about the World Trade Center. We are expected to believe that 220 acres of steel-reinforced, truss-supported concrete floors and all the contents that are assumed were there at the time, contents like plumbing pipes and the water therein, HVAC, electrical panels and cabling, car-sized elevator motors, miles of elevator cables, industrial kitchens with stainless steel steam kettles, refrigerators and tables, tile floors, hundreds of elevator doors, bathroom fixtures, office furniture, and not to mention thousands of people were turned to dust on 9/11. But all of that relies on the assumption that the Port Authority's building was completed as they say it was. Unfortunately, we have to take their word for it. However, the evidence shows that on 9/11, the Twin Towers were gutted and empty of contents, as all controlled demolitions are, but considering the history of the real estate market at the time, the character of the players involved, and with the benefit of almost 50 years of hindsight, the possibility should be considered that the Twin Towers were built to be destroyed all along. I want to thank Rollie for having me, and hello to my friends Jim and Joe, and if Phil's there too. Hi, Phil. That's my opening statement.
That was an excellent first part. I was going to say, Jim, if you are done with your section of it, you could just say Joe, and he'll jump in after that particular round, if that's okay, as well. And of course, you could decline to use the full round as well. Let's go into the second round. We're going to be talking about Shanksville. What happened? Was it a phantom point? Go ahead. Let me go ahead and start the timer. Go ahead, Jim.
Thanks, Rollie. Yeah. To turn to the crash sites, what's most important to understand is two of those flights were not even in the air that day. It was a brilliant blues musician from Australia who first made that observation, namely that flights 11 North Tower and 77 the Pentagon weren't even on the Bureau of Transportation Statistics records. They weren't scheduled to fly that day. And where we know that pilots for 9/11 Truth have been able to track the other two flights, 93 Shanksville and 175 South Tower, and discovered they were still in the air after they had allegedly crashed, where Flight 93 was over Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, after it had officially crashed in Shanksville, and 175 was over Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, after it had officially hit the South Tower. I myself obtained the FAA registration records for the planes used for those flights, where the same plane, of course, can be used for different flights on different occasions, today from Tampa to Chicago, tomorrow from New York to Los Angeles, and discovered neither of them was deregistered until 28 September 2005, which raised the questions, how can planes that weren't even in the air have crashed on 9/11? And how can planes that crashed on 9/11 have still been in the air 4 years later? Since none of the planes crashed, it turns out that no passengers purportedly aboard those planes died in crashes that did not take place, and that therefore the alleged 19 Islamic terrorists did not cause them to crash. Indeed, as David Ray Griffin made the very first point in his magisterial 9/11 Commission report, Omissions and Distortions, a half a dozen or more turned up alive and well and made contact with the British media the following day, even though then director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, made no effort to adjust the record, the list they had of the alleged 19 participants, because, of course, it was completely fraudulent. If we turn to Shanksville, we find there's a hole in the ground about 10 by 20, which, of course, is inconsistent with the size of a Boeing 757, which has a 125-foot wingspan, has a tail that stands 44 feet above the ground and weighs over 100 tons. But we don't find a massive pile of aluminum debris, just a hole in the ground. If you compare with what we see of real crash sites, for example, in Missouri or in Amsterdam or in Russia, you can see this is not a bona fide crash site, where even interviews with reporters at the time were reporting the eerie aspect of the crash site was there was no sign that any plane had crashed there because none had. Indeed, the fanciful story was made that you couldn't find any debris because it had disappeared into an abandoned mine shaft. but we do know what to do with miners trapped in mine shaft. We break out the bright lights and the heavy equipment and dig 24/7 in the hope that by some miracle we might recover a body. In this case, that wasn't even done to recover the purported passengers aboard the plane or its parts. It was a complete sham, quite embarrassing, and a very obvious indication of the fakery that constitutes the core of the 9/11 story.
Joe, jump in.
First of all, the Port Authority didn't have the ability to permit those buildings. Those buildings were permitted by the City of New York, and I saw the signed stamped drawings from the engineers that were approved by the City of New York. I had City of New York inspectors. Every bit of the steel that was in that building would have been ASTM rated steel and would have had a chain of custody going back to the original mills that rolled the steel, to the fabrication plants over in New Jersey that produced the exterior steel panels that were shipped across on barges and then lifted by cranes and installed in the building. You can watch the building being built. You can see the cement trucks going in. You can see the floors being poured. To assert that the buildings were not constructed of the 100,000 tons of steel and 100,000 tons of concrete is just patently absurd. The buildings were designed to take 120-mile-an-hour wind loads. They had 5 hurricanes that hit during the course of the life of those buildings. They never suffered any structural damage from any of those impacts. The buildings were never completely occupied, so some of the floors were never built out, so they were just in raw form. And if you go to FEMA 403 CH2, I don't trust the government to do a whole lot of stuff right, but the FEMA material, it's called WTC 1 and 2 Building Description, Section 2.1. And there again, it's FEMA 403 underlined CH2. And they give a complete description on how the buildings were built with their Vanderreel trusses on the exterior of the building and all the interior columns and all of the framing. They show extensive detail, which is entirely consistent with my 50 years experience as a structural engineering student and junior engineer and then registered engineer, and consistent with the material that I saw on the New York City approved plans. And the way buildings are built, you have to get construction draws, which require sign-offs from the building inspectors that the stuff was built and by the base building engineer. So the ability to build a fake building and have it stand for 30 years waiting for it to fall apart is complete non-starter. So that's item number one. Now, Steve Diak was interviewed by Jim Fetzer, and Jim produced a really nice segment of material, Steve Diak, Taboo Truths, Clues Avoided by the 911 Commission. And this was published at Jim's website February 7th of 2018. And I applaud Steve for bringing certain things to my attention that I didn't realize under all the other analysis that I'd done of the building. And that was the removal of the spandrel bolts and the removal of the end bolts to blow out 3-story sections of the exterior waffle panel. And those would have been 2-column groups that were fabricated together and shipped across the Hudson and swung into place and bolted into place and then welded into the floor rods. What the FEMA documents state is that they allowed the World Trade Center to remove sections of the floor so that tenants could be connected by interior stairwell. And I think Steve is correct on that. What they did is they came in and at the locations where they planned to have the impact strike, they cut out sections of the floor which would have been welded to the exterior spandrel sections and exterior columns, and they removed that material which would have supported it, and then they removed the bolts that held the top and bottom ends of the plate girders together, and then removed the spandrel sections that hold the sidewalls together and placed shaped charges on them and blew them out. And one of those panel sections landed next to the Trinity Orthodox church. And it's obvious when you look at the photos of it, which Steve provided to us, that the bolts did not suffer any shear. So all of those bolts would have absolutely had to fail, which is impossible without having any failure around the flange material. And then they showed dents in the middle of them where they had shaped charges and blown those sections out of the building. So what they did is, prior to the impact of the missile, which they needed to produce the soundtrack of a plane coming into the building, they had a explosion that blew out 2 panel sections at each impact location. And then you can see from Steve's photos, you can see the square plate girders being deformed from an impact, and the impact crosses over where the blown out holes were. So Steve's information was critical in understanding exactly how they were able to synthesize the plane impact, because they needed something to produce the sound, and they needed something that they could project their holographic image on. But the actual explosion occurred just prior to the missile impact, and that's how they created the holes in the side of the building. Jim and I discussed this in our interview at his website with Steve Diak, and I believe June of 2017. And then Jim and I also discussed all of this material in an additional interview in January of this year at Grissom website. And we can put up links to those so that anybody that's interested can go back and hear previous discussions of this. We don't end up repeating everything. But I want to thank Steve for bringing some very important material to the table, but I also reject his hypothesis that the buildings were not built out of steel and concrete, because that's easily provable.
I did not say that. They were not built out of steel and concrete, but we are talking about Shanksville. The story of average Americans who fought to the death in defense of America's capital, which everyone assumes was Flight 93's target, digs right into our emotions, just like all good propaganda does. In my opinion, the reason Shanksville was necessary is that without Flight 93's chapter, the 9/11 story only depicted corporate and military power under attack. And for folks on the street who have no sympathy for corporations and who think the military can take care of itself, there was no guarantee that they would be outraged enough to support a never-ending war on terror. But by including Flight 93, America itself became the target, and no one messes with baseball, mom, and apple pie without paying a price. If war was the goal, then Shanksville sealed the deal. Thanks to the many false and confusing narratives about Shanksville, most truthers don't even give it any attention. But Shanksville is 9/11's lowest hanging fruit. A quick examination of the impact site shows 2 shallow gashes extending at opposite directions from a deeper central crater, and a third shallower gas supposedly left by a horizontal stabilizer. As was recently pointed out to me by Mark Conlon, the 2 wing gashes actually terminate in smaller craters next to the larger crater. That makes 3 gashes and 3 craters. NASA has some photos on the web from an experiment where they use a hypervelocity gun to recreate the craters made by meteorites impacting at oblique trajectories. They proved that the gashes are predictable and reproducible. I don't have a hypervelocity gun handy, but I do have firearms, slingshots, and pellet guns, as well as a variety of small explosives, and I can create smaller versions of that crash site all day long. Anyone can. Police ballistics departments use the same concepts to identify the location of the shooter based on the shape of the bullet hole. So the physical evidence at Shanksville indicates the wing gash was caused by the oblique impact of projectiles striking sequentially from opposite directions at trajectories of about 6 degrees from horizontal. The smaller gash for the tail was caused by a smaller projectile striking at an even shallower trajectory. I think the shape they were striving for was to have 3 craters, 2 smaller ones for the engines and 1 big one for the fuselage, and then the wing gashes, tying them together. How big of an explosive was used on those craters depends on the size of the holes. According to the official story, the crater measured around 15 feet deep by around 30 feet around. Now, bomb and missile crater photos are hard to find because a lot can be learned about an ordnance by examining the hole it makes. But I did find information in the public record about the bombs used to start avalanches, as well as reports from military personnel who have seen various bomb craters. It is safe to say that depending on the soil composition, around 200 pounds of explosives will create a hole roughly the same size as Shanksville's central crater. This led me to the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, which carries a 900-pound dense metal warhead capable of penetrating hardened targets without detonating. The off-the-shelf models of the JSAM carries 240 pounds of explosives, which can account for that central crater. The same missile with a smaller explosive payload can account for the wing gashes and the engine craters. Whether or not the JSAM was what was used, there is no doubt that technology existed at the time. So if it wasn't a JSAM, it was something similar. Witness reports varied, but one witness described a small white plane no wider than her van that flew under the power lines, right over her van, and then swooped up to miss the tree line, banked to the right, and crashed. JSAMs look like small white planes and are about the same size as she described and are capable of performing such maneuvers. She also reported seeing 2 jet fighters at a high altitude. JSAMs coincidentally are air-launched from such jets. Some witnesses reported seeing a military jet that matches the description of an A-10 Warthog. Warthogs are not equipped to carry a JSAM, but they do carry Hydra air-to-surface rockets, which can account for that smaller tail gash I mentioned earlier. Other witnesses who have military experience reported hearing missiles. The damage to the woods at Shanksville is consistent with the detonation of an explosive above the trees, which is also consistent with a missile explosive. There is evidence of the use of a portable smoke generator at Shanksville too. If you go to my website, 911crashtest.org, and look at the Rumble over the Rubble link there, you'll see some images of the Shanksville site, and you'll see photographs of the smoke plume from within the crater and then again from without the crater. They were moving around a smoke generator to make it look worse. Taken together, the witness reports and the impact damage indicate multiple cruise missiles and at least 1 rocket were launched at Shanksville. This puts the blame squarely on the shoulders of the U.S. military.
All right, excellent. We're going to go on to part 3. We're going to be discussing the Pentagon. Jim, are you ready to get into part number 3?
Absolutely. This was a perfect illustration of why I find exchanging with Stephen so fascinating. This was extremely interesting. I'm glad we agree that no plane crashed there, because we're talking about an obvious violation of the laws of cause and effect. If a plane crash was supposed to be the cause, we obviously have an absence of the effect. Since there's no airplane debris, there ought to have been, a massive pile from a 100-ton aluminum airliner, body, seats, luggage, tail, wings, none of which is present. In fact, when Colonel George Nelson and I discussed Shanksville, where Colonel Nelson was himself an air crash investigator, he told me it looked to him as though someone had taken a bulldozer out there and dug a trench, filled it with trash, and blown it up. Steve's account is not that far different. More interesting, even in terms of the laws of aerodynamics and physics, is a situation at the Pentagon, where we have, of course, the 5 frames from the one Pentagon video that was released, which appear to be completely contrived. We do see over a gate mechanism the outline of what appears to be possibly a small aircraft. When I asked Jack White, with whom I was familiar from his brilliant work in JFK, to size the image of a Boeing 757 to the tail, it turned out to be about twice the size of the plane. Obviously, this was not a Boeing 757. However, it's perfectly consistent with an unmanned aerial vehicle, in particular a Global Hawk, where the white plume, pilots and aeronautical engineers have explained to me, could not be the exhaust of the jet, which would be black, but was consistent with that of a missile being fired into the building. We also have the hit site on the ground floor, where the hole's about 10 feet high and 15 to 17 feet wide. We have chain link fence. We have 2 vehicles, 2 large spools of cable, unbroken windows surrounding, but no massive pile of debris from a 100-ton airliner, no bodies, no seats, no luggage, no wings, no tail, not even the engines, which are virtually indestructible, were recovered from the Pentagon. We did have a collapsed section of the Pentagon that actually took place as much as 45 minutes or more later, which appears to have been done because the damage initially didn't look sufficiently severe. My favorite photograph of the Pentagon is the two civilian lime green vehicles putting out the very modest fires that remain, and you can see the clear Pentagon lawn with no debris whatsoever. There are many others of that kind where the debris only turned up later and appears to me to have been dropped from a C-130 that was circling the building. By far the most interesting piece was a section of fuselage from, yes, a Boeing 757, but it didn't show the signs of having been crumpled in a violent explosion, those signs of being exposed to intense fire. It had most unusually a piece of vine, not indigenous to the Arlington, Virginia area, ensnared in it. A retired attorney from Columbus, Ohio by the name of Jim Hansen tracked it down to the crash of a Boeing 757 near Cali, Colombia, that occurred in 1995, where the Israelis took control of the debris in that area. The vines are indigenous, and the plane passed through them en route to its collision with the side of a mountain. The official trajectory has a Boeing 757 skimming the ground at over 400 miles an hour. That turns out to be aerodynamically impossible, as one aeronautical engineer explained to me. That plane at that speed could not have got closer than 60 or even 80 feet to the ground, which higher than the Pentagon at 71 feet is tall. So we have a fantasy story. We also have the interesting work by the Citizens Investigative Team, who discovered witnesses at the Citgo station who reported seeing a plane approach the building to the left, facing the building, or to the north, when the official trajectory would have come in from the south. There appears to have been a plane which the Secretary of Transportation, Mineta, reported to the 9/11 Commission, but which they completely ignored, of an aide to the Vice President in an underground bunker beneath the White House, explained to him, "Sir, it's 50 miles out. Sir, it's 40 miles out. Sir, it's 30 miles out. Do the orders still stand?" Where Cheney got very upset, whipped around and said, "Of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?" Although Mineta didn't realize the order had to be to not shoot down the plane. That would have been the obvious thing to do. You lose the plane and the passengers, but not the property and the personnel at the target. The plane appears to have flown toward the building and then swerved over it. A friend of mine from JFK Research by the name of Roy Schaefer has a friend, Dave Ball, who was a trucker and was in front of the building at the time, who told Roy how he had watched a plane approach the building and then swerve over it. I tried to talk Roy into having Dave come on my show, but he was reluctant to do it. I told him to explain to Dave he'd be safer once he got his story out, but Dave was unwilling, and 2 weeks later was found dead in an abandoned building. We even have no less an expert than Jamie McIntyre, the chief correspondent for CNN on the scene at the time, explained to an anchor who asked about the crash of a plane, saying, "Well, you might think that, but from his close-up inspection, there was no sign of any plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon, that the really small pieces you could pick up on in your hand, no signs of a real plane in terms of wings, tail, and so forth." And of course, we have April Gallup, who actually was a civilian working at the Pentagon, who said the explosion occurred when she pressed her computer. She actually walked out of the hole in the building and smelled explosive, but saw no signs of any aircraft debris. General Albert Stubblebine, who was formerly in charge of all U.S. military signals intelligence, in other words, an expert on photographs, gave an interview with a German reporter explaining how he was convinced that no plane had hit the Pentagon, for the simple reason that the imprint of the aircraft would have been visible on the side of the building. I was fairly astonished when we got a report late on 9/11 of black billowing clouds when the rumor rampant swept the Capitol that a plane, apparently 93, was supposed to be heading there, might strike the building. So the members of the House and the Senate rushed out on the steps, looked across the Potomac, and saw these billowing black clouds. When I investigated, I discovered they were coming from a series of enormous dumpsters. They weren't from the fire in the building at all, but a series of enormous dumpsters, which were a special effect intended to make an impression on the members of Congress, where none other than Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld would waltz into the halls of Congress and ask for hundreds of billions of more in defense spending after having the day before announced that the Pentagon was missing $2.3 trillion from its records, which is a very odd thing to have done on a Monday because, as any experienced politician knows, a big story like that is going to grow legs during the week. It's as though he anticipated something would occur to wipe the consciousness of that development from the minds of Americans. And of course, that was because he knew what was coming the following day. Let me add that so much of the evidence in this case is photographic and video that it's very important to have the opportunity to compare the slides and the videos that demonstrate what I'm addressing here, where you can find such a video with 130 slides in 9/11, who was responsible, why on BitChute, but also in a book, my second on 9/11, with 15 contributors entitled America Nuked on 9/11, Compliments of the CIA, the Neocons in the Department of Defense, and the Mossad.
One additional thing, the $2.1 trillion records were in the impact zone and were destroyed that day, along with 39 members of the Able Danger Army Intelligence Unit that had been tracking Muhammad Atta and several of the other hijackers for 6 months and were ordered to be disbanded.
Joe, we're talking about the Pentagon.
I know, that is the Pentagon.
Okay,
yeah, Joe's talking about the West Wing, where Rumsfeld had the section chief bring all the members of the financial branch, and this was accounting expert, budget experts, into the West Wing, which had been recently reinforced, the only wing of the Pentagon to have been so reinforced, where I was astonished when I read the records of the casualties of the Pentagon, because as Joe's reporting, it includes 36 of these budget experts and analysts, and apparently destroyed most of the records pertaining to the missing $2.3 trillion, which is quite a powerful motive and incentive for erasing that aspect of the attack.
And the Army Able Danger Intelligence Unit, who had been tracking Muhammad Atta using a computer program up until January of 2001, when they were ordered disbanded by the Bush White House. Right after he took office, he disbanded them. And that morning, they were ordered to be at a meeting at 9 o'clock at the Pentagon. So they all showed up and they all died, which is more than convenient.
Steve, go ahead.
Okay. As far as the Pentagon goes, a lot of people already believe a missile was launched at the Pentagon, but I am not one of them, because no single missile can account for all of the damage. The damage to the facade must have been pretty disappointing to the perpetrators. I guess the Pentagon is sturdier than they thought. The first pictures of the facade damage pictured before the roof was collapsed clearly shows that there was no plane impact, because not only was there no plane debris, but there was no hole in the wall, which the jet allegedly bored through either. Initial reports were that a truck bomb had gone off, and the facade does appear to have had a bomb or two detonate near it, but there wasn't a bomb crater visible in the ground, implying that the blasts occurred some distance above the ground, which is consistent with the air blast of a high explosive delivered by cruise missile. Not all cruise missiles are created equal. Some, like the JSAM, are designed to bore through concrete before the warhead detonates, and others, like the Tomahawk, carry high explosives that are designed to detonate in airburst. JSAMs or other bunker busters would have left a distinct punch-in hole, which is not visible in the photos. Therefore, they weren't used. All that said, the facade damage was probably caused by a couple Tomahawk missiles. The so-called crash occurred at 9:37 a.m., but the roof didn't collapse until 10:10. Plenty of time for demolition engineers to rig the building with explosives. The perpetrators must have quickly done so to eliminate the embarrassment of not having a punch-in hole. The fact that there was no punch-in hole to match the 12-foot punch-out hole in the C-ring is evidence that they were not created by the same means. In other words, whatever it was that caused the punch-out hole, it was not what damaged the facade, nor was it what damaged the roof, nor was it what caused the damage to the interior columns. All of this damage was caused by using different means. So any continued discussion by the Truth Movement of the missile that plowed through the Pentagon does not match the evidence as found. Explosives on the facade can account for the damage there, whether delivered by missile or by truck bomb, but there are very few things that can account for the exit hole in the C-ring. Only one that I can find, and that's a large rapid wall breaching kit, or several normal-sized ones used together. For the damage to the forest of interior columns, they must have planted still more explosives. This evidence of the use of secondary explosives to collapse the roof, to damage the interior columns, and to create the punch-out hole is proof the Pentagon itself is responsible, not some rogue element and not some foreign entity like Israel. Evidence of the use of secondary explosives is also evidence that the impact zone was not occupied as was so advertised, because the planting of such explosives could not have been done without all occupants being aware of it. The missing trillions of dollars that Rumsfeld announced on September 10th and the rumor that the accountants who were allegedly working on exposing it were wiped out in the attack along with their data is a false lead, probably designed to make the empty impact area appear to be occupied, as well as to give the officially sanctioned 9/11 Truth Movement something to talk about. The alleged missing trillions of dollars were never missing. They were unaccounted for, and most of that money has since been accounted for. Furthermore, the accounting issue that Rumsfeld announced on September 10th of 2001 had been spoken of many times before then, which means that the claim that the missing trillions were buried behind the news of what happened on September 11th is not true. Besides, nowadays, the Pentagon can't account for far, far more than that, with 21 trillion being the latest figure in recent headlines that they can't account for. There's nothing new to see here. This rumor is another red herring. That being said, the real smoking gun at the Pentagon was the use of a military-grade smoke generator, which was more than just the dumpster fires that Jim was talking about. And there's this is visible, and it was captured on video and can be seen by anyone who cares to look at it. You can look on my video channel, Yankee 451, and just look for the smoke. What is the thing's called? Smoke screen at the Pentagon. There's a video that shows the smoke machine being used. A big plume of white smoke, not the black smoke that Jim was talking about. White smoke. This is a smoke machine. This puts the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the frame, because if 9/11 wasn't being run from the top down, then the military is too incompetent to justify its expense. There's no pretty way to paint this picture. When all the evidence is considered, the blame lands squarely on the shoulders of the U.S. military. Again, that's it.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to go to part 4. It's planes in New York. And this is just a summation of what happened with the planes itself and not how the tower. Tim, are you ready to give your interpretation, sir?
Yeah, absolutely. Not to impugn Steve's simplification of the situation, but is he going to tell us that Donald Rumsfeld did not announce that $2.3 trillion was missing from the Pentagon budget the day before 9/11? Is he going to suggest that Dov Zakheim, who is both a dual U.S.-Israeli citizen and Israeli, was not the controller, the chief financial officer of the Pentagon? I'm a bit perplexed by this. Certainly, he ought to understand the concept of the division of labor. The Israelis were given the primary task of destroying the World Trade Center. The Pentagon itself was very protective and wanted to ensure that whatever it did to its own building, it was done in such a way as not to create any lasting damage. So while I can agree with a lot of what Steve has to say, for example, it's clear the hole in the C-ring, which had spray painted on the wall punch out, was done using cordite. In fact, many mentioned there was a strong smell of cordite. It was too symmetrical to have been from the landing gear, which would have hit the building, hit that wall at an angle and therefore not created a symmetrical effect. When we turn to New York, we have to distinguish between video fakery and fake videos. What we appear to have are videos that show an image, a projected image of a plane at both the North and the South Tower. Some of the indication that what we're seeing is not a real plane even if it's a real video, include that the aircraft approaching the South Tower, this is, of course, supposed to be Flight 175, was traveling faster than is aerodynamically possible for a Boeing 767 at that altitude. The perps apparently took the cruising speed at 35,000 feet and presumed the plane could perform the same feat at 700 to 1,000, where the air is 3 times more thick, and the engines, the turbines, couldn't suck the air through. There's a brilliant affidavit about this from John Lear, our nation's most distinguished pilot, which you can find at 911scholars.ning.com online. Follow it up. Meanwhile, we have the plane effortlessly passing through the building. And by the way, for confirmation that the plane couldn't have physically flown at that altitude, pilots for 9/11 Truth have their own video called 9/11 Intercepted, where they show the actual effects of a 767 flying at that speed. It would have physically come apart in the air. Meanwhile, we have the plane simply disappearing into the building with no collision effects. This is a violation of the laws of physics, just as this plane traveling faster than aerodynamically possible, even in New York, is another violation of the laws of aerodynamics. The South Tower plane was intersecting with 8 different floors. Each consisted of a steel truss filled with 4 to 8 inches of concrete, the variance being because they were V-shaped trusses that were 4 inches deep. So in some region, it would be 4 and other 8 inches deep, connected at one end to the massive core columns, at the other to the external steel support columns, which were quite formidable in and of themselves. It would have been physically impossible for any plane to have penetrated those buildings. It would have crumpled external to the building, body, seats, luggage, tail, fallen to the ground. The engines might have penetrated, but not the rest of the plane. And yet we have the plane effortlessly passing into the building. It turns out that if you measure, as Joe Keith suggested, the number of frames it takes for the plane to pass its entire length into the building, that's equal to the number of frames it takes for the plane to pass through its entire length in air, which of course is a preposterous result unless a massive 500,000-ton steel and concrete building poses no more resistance to the trajectory of an aircraft in flight than air. Meanwhile, we have what appears to have been previously positioned jet fuel, napalm, whatever, to create the massive explosion, quite spectacular, disappears in about 15 seconds. And then we have only very modest fires that remain. Meanwhile, the similar effect is taking place at the North Tower. Actually, it had occurred earlier, where the plane was intersecting with 7 floors. The most astute analysis of what actually happened here, in my judgment, has been offered by Richard D. Hall, who studied the vast number of videos we have. There are like 52. He found some 27 were sufficiently precise to enable him to plot locations and times for the approaching Flight 175. He compared that with NIST data and found they had similar plots and similar times, which they attributed to radar, but their sources seemed suspect. He found there actually was radar data, but when he studied it was for a plane that was traveling 1,200 feet to the side, to the right of the projected image, leading him to infer, quite correctly in my judgment, that the plane was projecting the image of a plane. It was a holographic image, flew it right into the plane, which is why there were no collision effects. We even had the nose come out at the end, which is why the station suddenly faded to black, which was very, very odd indeed, considering this was historic footage. That's also confirmed by a page from an Australian military manual about an airborne holographic projector. A holographic projector displays a 3-dimensional visual image in a desired location remote from the display generator. The projector can be used for psychological operation and strategic perception management. It's also useful for optical deception and cloaking, providing a momentary distraction when engaging an unsophisticated adversary. So we had many, many witnesses reporting hearing the sound of a plane, seeing what they took to be a plane. It appears the sound they heard was from the plane projecting the image. I know of no better analysis of what took place here, where it can account for the impossible speed. It can account for the impossible physics, the lack of any collision, and for the radar data. which didn't detect a plane in the observed position because it was merely the image of a holograph, not a real plane, but it did detect the real plane, which was 1,200 feet to the side. When he applied a similar analysis to the North Tower, he came up with similar results. I highly recommended Richard Hall's analysis as basic to understanding how we were faked out by the videos on 9/11. And I remind you that pilots tracked Flight 175 and found it was over Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, after it had allegedly hit the South Tower, where I tracked down the FAA registration records and found the plane used for that flight was not taken out of service or formally deregistered until 28 September 2005.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, like I said, I agree with Steve's analysis of the blown out hole in the side of the building where the section ended up by St. Paul's Trinity Orthodox Church, 600 feet away from the building. And I also want to highly recommend that people go to the Memorandum for President 911 False Flag Volume 6 update at Robert David Steele's website. And he had 28 authors, including all three of the people that are debating tonight, which is me and Steve and Jim, along with John Lear, who's the pilot that said that they were holographic projections. And I agree that it was impossible for a plane to fly at that altitude. I was doing forensic engineering as an intern one summer in engineering school, and we were flying a Piper Seneca over about a 5-state area, doing inspections for forensic investigations. And I felt real nervous about being in a plane with nobody but one pilot. So I went and took pilot training. I soloed at 7 hours. I had 25 hours of solo time, including night flying. And I also had a bunch of friends with general aviation. I've probably got 200 hours and as right seat co-pilot in probably a dozen different airframes of general aviation. So I'm familiar with the requirements of aviation. I'm also familiar with construction of airplanes, and I've flown hundreds of commercial flights all over the United States in order to do work. And I've been to Europe 8 times and sailed the Nile. So I'm very familiar with aircraft and the limitations and the impossibility of the official narrative on what happened at 911 at any of these crash sites. So no objection there. And I do highly recommend, although I disagree with several of the authors, including I disagree with Judy Woods, as mentioned on the directed energy weapons. I also disagree with Tom Scott Gordon on the buildings being loaded with asbestos when the FEMA information says that asbestos was only on World Trade Center 1 and only through the 39th floor because it was banned by the EPA before it could be installed any further in the building. And a lot of that had been either mediated or removed. So that was not a factor. And I disagree with his hypothesis about the corrosion on the exterior of the building because that's not how buildings fail.
Yep. Go ahead, Steve.
All right. Yeah. Let's see. As far as the comment about the buildings not being built with steel and concrete, I did not say that. I commented on them. They're being built to be destroyed. All right. So I'd like to start with my comments about the planes with a quote from Gerard Holmgren. Quote, "It was a very simple con trick which shows a movie or a cartoon, whichever way you want to look at it, and they put the label news on it. And because nobody expected that they would lie to us in such a blatant fashion, we thought that it was real. They gave us one clip, which appeared to be a plane crashing into a building, but it actually wasn't. It was an animation of a plane passing behind a building. We saw that, and from that, we extrapolated in our minds the false illusion that we saw lots and lots of planes hitting lots and lots of buildings, and that we saw it live. Once you realize how the illusion was constructed, then it becomes very, very simple to unravel it. They showed us a movie, and they put the label of news on it, and we believed it because we weren't expecting it," unquote. Fortunately, once again, the crime scene contains clues as to what was happened, as to what was and what was not responsible. In the first 9 columns from the far left of the holes in both of the Twin Towers, almost identical damage can be seen. Starting with very lightly damaged aluminum sheeting, as you move to the right, the damage becomes progressively worse, eventually bending steel columns sharply to the right. On the 9th column, there is an inward blasting hole. Logically, to have nearly identical damage in the same place in the holes in both towers is an indication that the same means was used for both holes. It is also an indication that the planes we were shown on television were faked for several reasons, but including but not limited to: 1, the light damage to the aluminum cladding at the far left of the holes is far too small to have been caused by the wingtip from a 767. 2, the left-right trajectory of the bent steel is not at all consistent with the head-on impact of a 767 wing. Something bent the columns by striking them from the side, not by striking them head-on. 3, the inward blasting holes on the 9th columns were nowhere near where the engines of the jet impacted on TV. As Holmgren was well aware, the videos of the plane crashes were faked, but if they were faked, then what cut the holes in the towers? This damage is evidence that planted explosives alone were not used, for certainly they would not have used them to bend the steel in the wrong direction. Therefore, the damage indicates exactly what it appears to indicate: the lateral impact of small projectiles. Cruise missiles, of course, fit the bill, and there were multiple reports of missiles being seen and heard at the World Trade Center. To see how the con trick was accomplished, it is very important to understand the timeline of the event. The fact is, none of the so-called live shots of Flight 175 shows the impact of the plane with the building. All of the videos that were broadcast live depict what appears to be a plane flying behind the towers, followed by an explosion, but none of them captured the actual collision. No one ever saw the impacts live on television. Anyone who says they did is mistaken. Those clips that do show the plane sliding like butter into the steel building were all released later. They were not shown live as they happened. A logical conclusion, and one that fits the damage evidence, is that the amateur footage was released later and not live because the small army of propagandists that was deployed to pose as amateurs needed to record whatever it was that actually struck the towers before they could edit it out of their respective footage and edit in a jet. Furthermore, all of the images of the planes show anomalies that indicate they are fraudulent, every one. But comparatively, though, all of the images and videos of the explosion after the impact are consistent from video to video and photo to photo, which is an indication that they are genuine. So if, as the damage indicates, the videos of the plane approaches and impacts are phony, but the videos of the explosions are real, then it stands to reason that they stitched together the fake video with the real video at that point between where the last of the plane entered the building and the point where the fireball erupted. That's why the plane had to penetrate fully before the fireball erupted, because it was just a video layer of a plane on top of a real video of an explosion that would have been identified as fraudulent immediately. So they had to have the plane disappear before the fireball. The fireball was intended to be seen by everyone because shock and awe was the whole point. Everyone's memories and personal photos of the fireball will match the public record because the fireball was real, but no real amateurs captured a plane because there wasn't one. Other truthers have noticed how the plane penetrated the tower and the tower appeared to self-heal after the wing penetrated the wall. Well, that's the nature of video layers. The plane was a video layer on top of another video layer of the undamaged tower, and both of those layers were hanging like a curtain in front of the real video layer, which undoubtedly showed the missile impacts. The assumption that this lie is too big and that someone would talk ignores the fact that even if someone did report the truth, why would the authorities tell we the people when they were selling us a terrorist attack? The assumption that the planes were real and that holograms were used, it ignores the fact that holograms cannot be broadcast in broad daylight, and that it ignores the fact that something had to cut the holes in the tower. And so if for holograms to have been used, the assumption is that explosives cut the holes in the towers. But as the physical evidence to the towers shows, something physically struck them from the side. So even if the hologram was masking whatever really was there, it wouldn't have masked what struck from the side. Whatever it was came in from outside the frame and would have been visible anyway. So whatever caused the damage, whether it was a hologram that was being broadcast or not, the damage would have had to have been edited out of the video too. So, I mean, whatever caused the damage would have been edited out of the hologram video as well. Because holograms don't cut steel and explosives don't bend steel like we see in the damage. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Hey, thanks again for giving us the information on the blown hole. And it's hard to visualize this stuff. I want everybody to go to FEMA 403_CH2. Their figure 2.3 shows how these waffle panels were actually constructed and bolted into place. And that's the existing condition on the building. Their figures 213 and 215 and 218 show the damage that Steve's talking about, where you have the impact coming across the openings, but you very clearly have two panels, which would be columns 90, 95, 96, 97 vertically, and then horizontally they would be columns number 127 and 133. Those are the waffle panels that were installed as complete panels and then unbolted and blown out as complete panels to create the holes where the impressions of the fuselage and the two engines would have supposedly entered the building. And that's obvious when you look at the photo, which is an actual damage photo that's part of the FEMA report. So I want to encourage people to go and look at that, because then you'll be able to understand and replay what we're talking about, because it all makes sense. I have no disagreement with Steve on that. Holograms, I'm pretty sure, can be projected in broad daylight because they've used it for protecting tanks by taking a visual image of the background of a tank and projecting it in front of the tank and making a tank visually disappear. So it's not impossible technology, and it's a simultaneous event. It's probably the greatest theater that we've ever seen, and it involved, I'm sure, some CGI and everything else. But basically, they blew some panels out of the side of those buildings, and then they hit them with a missile. And the missile would have given you the soundtrack of a plane coming in, and I'm doubtful that anybody would have been able to tell the difference between a twin-engine fan jet and a missile strike at that point, with all the other explosions that were going on, because there was explosions prior to any impact and there were explosions after impacts. So there was plenty of noise, ambient noise going on. And once you had one building involved, then nobody could really focus on what was happening on the second building either, because you had that additional distraction. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Absolutely, absolutely incredible. Let's get on to part number 5, how the towers were destroyed. And there were 3 towers destroyed that day: World Trade Center 1, 2, and the Solomon Building, number 7. Jim, can you give your interpretation about that fateful day in Manhattan with the towers?
Absolutely. Just a couple of points in relation to what Steve and Joe have been talking about. I appreciate Joe's observation that holograms can be projected in daylight. In fact, Steve seems to be behind the curve here. Military technology is typically 10 to 20 years ahead of what civilians are allowed to know. There's a new form of holographic projection onto air, which actually uses the molecules of air as a transitory screen for the projection, which appears to be what happened here. Just to make a couple of key points about why I think he's mistaken when he gets down to the details. Remember, we had the nose out phenomenon that caused the networks to go to fade to black, which was a bizarre occurrence, unless you realize that they had a glitch in the holographic projection. And more important than that, if they were doing the editing after the fact, as Steve suggests, then it's peculiar that we have this anomaly that there were explosions in the sub-basements of each of the twin towers, which were rather massive. Willie Rodriguez has talked about it, for example, how he watched the sub-basement fill up with water. They appear to have been designed to drain the sprinkler systems of water so that they couldn't extinguish the very modest fires that remained after these spectacular fireballs occurred. But it turns out that, as Gordon Ross and Craig Furlong has observed, there were 14 and 17 second errors there, that the explosions took place 14 and 17 seconds before the impact of the planes with the buildings, which seems to me very difficult to explain if Steve's account here were correct. Meanwhile, to get the key to understanding what happened to the Twin Towers, you have to contrast with Building 7, which was a classic controlled demolition. You had all the floors coming down at the same time, implying all the support columns had been removed. You had them coming down at approximately the speed of 3 fall in about 6.5 seconds. And when it was over, you had a classic pile of debris equal to about 12% of the height of the original 47 floors or 5.5 floors. Now, this is particularly striking because we also know that we had a fellow inside the building that morning who was had gone there from the New York Emergency Center and to Rudy Giuliani's Command and Control Center, which had its own air and its own water. He arrived there only to find that there were half-eaten sandwiches, still steaming cups of coffee. A fireman came along and said, "We got to get you out of here." Explosions were taking place while he was there. He had a stairwell blown out from under him. He felt himself stepping over dead bodies. And when he got out, he gave interviews, which are still available online. Interestingly, although the 9/11 Commission report didn't even mention Building 7, when NIST finally was about to release its report, he died mysteriously 2 days in advance. Contrast that now with the Twin Towers, where all the floors remain stationary in place, waiting their turn to be blown to kingdom come. Externally, they're being blown apart from the top down and being converted into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust. That, by the way, is a sign of the use of nuclear devices, the conversion of materials into very fine dust. And when it was over, remarkably enough, there was no pile of debris in their footprint. None of that 12% of the height of the original, which ought to have equaled 13.5 floors or so. I had Father Frank Morales on my radio shows twice, where he was a first responder from St. Mark's Episcopal Church. And both times he was emphatic in emphasizing that the Twin Towers had been destroyed to below ground level. This means it was a completely different mode of destruction for the Twin Towers and for Building 7. So while I refer to Building 7 as a classic controlled demolition, I refer to the Twin Towers as a demolition under control, about which Joe will have much more to say.
Yes. Like I said, I attended the meetings with the 911 group, and one of their productions was a booklet called Beyond Misinformation, which was printed in 2015. And on page 42, it says that it takes 0.13 pounds of thermite is required to melt each pound of steel. Well, if you're missing 100,000 pounds of steel, you multiply times 0.1 pounds, and that tells you how many pounds of thermite it would take to melt the steel, which melts at 2,750 degrees Fahrenheit, but steel is vaporized at 5,200 degrees Fahrenheit. The steel that is not in the ground was vaporized. And what happens when you have a nuclear explosion? The first thing that travels through the building is a shock wave. The shock wave would have broken the bolted joints connecting the beams and columns, and it would have exceeded the acceleration velocity, the detonation velocity for steel, which is 6,100 meters per second, which would have caused a certain portion of the steel to be fragmented into molecules just from the shock wave. Then you have the heat wave, which would have vaporized them. Steve made a point about the aluminum exterior cladding. That was a 0.19 inch thick cladding, which was really very, very thin, but there was 2,200 tons of aluminum on those two buildings on all of the exterior. And when you have vaporized aluminum and you have oxidized vaporized steel, you can form thermite, and that's where the thermite comes from. That the A&E group said, if you find thermite in the dust, that is thermite that was not broken apart in a thermal reaction. So whatever thermite that they find in the dust was not used to melt the steel of the building. So that would have added to the additional 100,000 pounds of steel times 0.13 pounds of thermite that would have been required to be placed in the building. In addition, thermite burns at 4,000 degrees, so it's impossible to vaporize steel. And thermite's very difficult to get started. It requires a 3,000 degree, generally magnesium fused starter. So to sequence all of that and the possibility of being able to bring the building down is absolutely absurd. The bombs that went off prior to the fall of the building were to close the connection between the buildings so you didn't get gamma bleed over from one nuclear bomb in the basement setting off the other nuclear bomb prematurely. There was a 2.3 Richter scale explosion 14 seconds or 12 seconds prior to any initiated collapse in World Trade Center 1, and a 2.1 Richter scale explosion 12 seconds prior to any visual collapse on World Trade Center 2. So those two buildings were brought down by nuclear bombs. I agree that there was a lot of controlled demolition in the 47-story tall World Trade Center 7, which fell in 7 seconds. But there again, you would have had an enormous amount of explosives, and when they do that, they come in and they remove all the shear walls and they remove a lot of the moment connections, and that would have required an enormous amount of pre-planning. I think there was a possibility that it was a nuclear and conventional in that particular building. And then also nobody's mentioned World Trade Center 6, which was a 7-story building that had a gold vault in the bottom that the firemen went in and found the door of the vault open and completely empty. And that building looks like a volcano. As a matter of fact, if you look at the thermal imaging of the World Trade Center site, it looks like a series of volcanoes went off. And then if you look at the 80 articles that were produced on Nuclear 911 by veterans today, several of them were reposted recently at Jim Fetzer's website, and they show photos of the volcanic eruption that had occurred underneath the bottoms of those buildings, where they actually vaporized the granite bedrock underneath the foundation of the building 100 feet. And you can see pictures of the workers down underneath there, and you can see the igneous formation that was left after they removed what was the concrete and steel that fell down into that pit. And those photos are available again on Jim's website. It was done by Gordon Duff with Veterans Today. There's 2 articles that were posted next to when he reposted my Twin Towers nuclear memo to the president on his website about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So we need to put those links in your show notes so that people can go and review that in addition to this other material. Steve, over to you.
Yeah, I urge people to look that up, because if you look at the evidence of the nuclear, the vaporized rock that he's talking about, you'll also have to research why they had to build the bathtub, because, man, because the ground was all saturated and wet. All right, that vaporized stone you're talking about is what they call a prehistoric pothole. It's caused by erosion from glaciers. I mean, look at the geography of the area, man. They're all over the place there. They're all over the place there. So how they were demolished is, I'll explain now. History shows that by the time the construction began, the local and national economies were slipping, and New York was already glutted with office space, with vacancy rates not seen since the Great Depression. So it provided a very strong incentive for the Port Authority of New Jersey and New York to complete their buildings with much less than the advertised space, but still be able to claim to have the tallest buildings in the world. Being the Port Authority, they could say whatever they wanted, and the public would have to take their word for it because they don't answer to us. But what they needed was an architect who could design the tallest buildings in the world in such a way that they didn't need to build out all the space. By build out, I mean to build out the entire infrastructure of what would normally be included in any floor of any office building: electrical, plumbing, HVAC, etc. They found that architect in Minoru Yamasaki, who had strong ties to the defense industry, to the CIA, as well as to Saudi Arabia's bin Laden construction. Yamasaki was selected as architect because he would do as he was told and not ask questions. To complete their ruse, the PATH station and the mall would always give the World Trade Center that hustle and bustle of a city within the city, and any tourists or prospective tenants would be taken on a tour to the available floors as they would in any office building. They would see the lobby, the observation deck, windows on the world, and select places in between. No one would inspect all 220 floors ever. Unoccupied floors would be locked down from the stairwells, and elevators wouldn't stop there, which are standard practices for a commercial building. The World Trade Center was the only office building to have its own police force, with dozens of armed officers stationed at the World Trade Center. Therefore, anything that occurred there, from the various publicity stunts to any and all preparations for the demolition of the World Trade Center, was well known by the Port Authority police and certainly by the governors of New York and New Jersey. For a complex with allegedly 50,000 people in it during the day, to the local residents, it did seem odd that with all the lights still on in the towers, the place was deserted after 6 p.m. They expected to see more activity. And there's another clue. Only the lighting was needed to make the locals believe the place was fully occupied, allowing the Port Authority to hide mostly empty buildings in plain sight until the time was right. Fortunately for them, the Twin Towers were built with a centrally controlled lighting system. The World Trade Center was heavily marketed as being synonymous with America, but there was nothing remotely true about that. They were obviously using the media to exaggerate its importance, probably because they had big plans for it. Planning for 9/11 proper began at least as far back as the 80s, with the 1993 bombing being the go-live date, when the Port Authority likely bombed itself as a way to set the stage for 9/11 by making the public believe the towers were targets for Islamic extremism. That bombing also served double duty by allowing legitimate tenants to break their leases and get out of Dodge, and under cover of the repairs, the preparations for controlled demolition could begin. Any tenants that wouldn't leave at that time were forced out with huge rent increases, which can be corroborated by the history, and which could be blamed on the repairs, only to be replaced with all the false front brass plate offices of all the big name firms that collected billions of dollars from the victim and business compensation funds. By the time 9/11 rolled around, the Twin Towers had been prepared for demolition by removing non-load-bearing walls and floors, plumbing, electrical, and HVAC, as well as most of the windows, as is normal practice with controlled demolitions, and there is photographic evidence to support this. Evidence of screens having been hung over the windows as a way to camouflage the missing glass, and there is further evidence of the removing of interior contents so that they could access the structural members. You can see throughout the FEMA photographs of all of the, if you go to my website, you can look at a post called FEMA Missing Bolts in Old Glory. You will find dozens of photographs all throughout the FEMA demolition or debris field shots that show missing bolts everywhere. Everywhere. It's like it's obvious what happened. They dismantled these buildings and blew them apart and faked it as a terrorist attack. There's even photographic or video images, evidence of dust and paper pouring out of a wall column long before the collapse of the towers. This is after a plane impact and kerosene fires, and there's video evidence of dust and paper pouring out of the column. Okay, that is evidence that the dust was in dust form prior to the first impacts, and you can look at it. I've got a link there right in the chat of our conference call here that shows the video. Dust and paper pouring out of the wall. It was already filled with dust. Steel does not turn to dust, Joe. It does not turn to dust with nuclear weapons. If it's going to melt stone, it's going to melt steel. It's not going to dustify it.
It does more than melt steel.
No, Joe.
It vaporizes steel. But let's get back to the foundation of the building.
Hey, Joe, hold it for 1 second. Joe, we're going to do rebuttals right now. I'm going to give Jim Fetzer the floor, And we can definitely do what you're talking about now. Let's go ahead and move it to Jim real quick. Jim, are you ready to give a rebuttal?
Sure. Well, unless I missed something, the story that Steve is presenting here is that the buildings were so flimsy they virtually fell of their own accord, in which case we have to ask the question, well, where did they go? As Father Frank Morales observed, they were not there in a massive pile of debris in their own footprints. That indicates something extraordinary happened, very different than would be consistent with what Steve has been telling us. The buildings were extremely robust. They were an ingenious tube within a tube designed to maximize office space. So you had 47 massive core columns that were tapered from 6 inches thick, the steel in the sub-basements, up to a 1/4 inch at the very top. They were then connected by steel trusses to the external steel support columns, which were quite formidable in and of themselves, 230 of them of their own accord, providing massive external support as well. Chuck Baldwin, who is a retired high school math, physics, and chemistry teacher, has calculated that for every unit of downward pressure, given the design of the building, there were 199 units of upward pressure. There was no way the buildings could have collapsed. And it's quite bizarre to me that Steve wants to suggest their flimsy construction could have contributed thereto. There's nothing that supports it. I think that Joe has made nice points about nanothermite. We know that hypothesis is indefensible. It turns out that in order for an explosive to destroy steel, it must, or a material, it must have a detonation velocity equal to or greater than the speed of sound in that material. The speed of sound in cement is 3,200 meters per second. The speed of sound in steel is 6,100 meters per second. But the highest attributed detonation velocity for nanothermite is only 895 meters per second. That means you can't get there from there. T. Mark Hightower, who's a chemical engineer, and I published 3 articles in 2011 exposing this major defect. Architects and engineers has never responded for the obvious reason they have no response. I'd also observed that the Copenhagen chemistry professor Niels Harrit estimated that since nanothermite is actually a feeble explosive, it only has 1/13 the explosive force of TNT, which is the universal standard. He estimated it would have taken 29,000 metric tons of nanothermite to explode a tower. That is a manifest absurdity and is a reduction of the claim that nanothermite was done. It turns out, interestingly enough, that because of the chemical interaction between the aluminum cladding and steel and a residual effect of the destruction of the towers, particularly using nuclear devices, for which we have a lot of confirmation, would have been particles that would have resembled the nanothermite chips that Steve Jones found from one apartment where he studied the dust. I'd mentioned the fundamental fact of the matter is the U.S. Geological Survey studied dust samples from 35 locations in Manhattan, and they found a host of elements that would not have been present in their quantities and correlations had this not been a nuclear event, including barium, lithium, lanthanum, tritium, some of which only exist in radioactive forms. And we've had what have been estimated as many as 70,000 first responders and local residents who've suffered from the debilitating effects associated with exposure to ionizing radiation, multiple myeloma, leukemia, esophageal, pancreatic, and other exotic cancers, quite analogous to what occurred at Chernobyl with regard to the residents there of that effect. So it seems to me, Steve, at this point has really collapsed his theory of the building itself as having been so flimsy, it might as well have collapsed of its own accord, has itself collapsed as a theory. It had to go somewhere. It's not there. What Joe has been explaining about the nuclear demolition appears to be quite brilliant. While I originally believed it was a sophisticated arrangement of mini or micro nukes, I'm now inclined to believe that Joe's got it right. When I interviewed Kalazar, Dmitry Kalazar years ago, and he talked about the buildings being destroyed from the bottom up. I said, so that the appearance of the building still remaining intact was an illusion. And he said that was true, which I found very difficult to absorb. But Joe's explained how you had the explosion using the nuke from the bottom up for the inner core. And then it went all the way up and had all the effects that were then visible externally to the outer core. I think that is the most adequate explanation we have, certainly overwhelmingly more adequate than what Steve is seeking to advance here tonight.
The day after 9/11, Benjamin Netanyahu said that it took 350,000 tons of explosives to bring down each one of those buildings, which is a 0.4 kiloton bomb, which would be kind of hard to place that much explosives in the building. But you're only talking about a 250, 300-pound bomb that you could roll in with a dolly and place in elevator number 50 on the basement, sixth level basement floor, 40 feet below street level. And that's where you were on absolute bedrock. You look at the geologic soils reports for the World Trade Center building. During the previous ice age, there was 1,000 feet of ice over Manhattan, and the sea level was 440 feet lower than it is today. The Hudson River is a fault line, and it had been a river during the ice age, and when the ice age started to melt, the water melted and ran down the Hudson River and had a waterfall out at the continental shelf and gradually filled up the Atlantic Ocean. And there was smooth bedrock at the bottom of that building. And that's what they set the building foundation on. And that's why they didn't go any deeper than 40 feet, because to do that, they would have had the blast, and that would have disturbed the 40 feet of former glacial till that was rock and dirt that had been in the 1,000 feet of glacier that had been overbearing on that granite bedrock for 100,000 years prior to that. There was no hole underneath there that was a glacier scoured hole. The glacier had scoured a pretty much level area and sat there for 100,000 years. And that's where the rock material came from. And that's why they didn't go any deeper than that when they did the foundation of the building. And that's why when you look at the igneous rock that's in the vaporized hole underneath the building, and the building was 2,500 degrees hot at that location until December of 2001, you realize that what you had was some slow fission material that ended up taking a long time to finally burn itself out. When you start with a nuclear trigger that's a 2 or 3 pound plutonium trigger and you wrap it with a thorium tamper, then the thorium absorbs the gamma rays, and that reduces a lot of your nuclear isotopes and a lot of your nuclear gamma ray signature. So you can disguise a bomb in what's called a minimal residual radiation bomb, an MRR, and it's also known as a pulsed nuclear laser bomb, which is what we use to replace the bunker buster bombs. And these things can burn through 4,000 feet of granite. And that's exactly what they did. They placed it in the basement, shot it up through the core of the building in the only elevator shaft that was continuous from basement level all the way up to the 110th floor, which is elevator number 50, which by coincidence was a freight elevator directly in the center of the building. And it was protected by elevator shafts and 3 stairway shafts that were all 2-hour rated from the ground floor all the way up to the ceiling and of the roof of the building. And so you had this inner core where you could concentrate the shock wave and the heat wave and burn the core of the building and let the core of the building start falling down into a crucible in the basement and be vaporized. And then if you look at the photos, it's obvious. It's pyroclastic flow. You've got smoke and heat coming up through the center core, and then all the way around all 4 sides of the building, you have this flow of pulverized concrete and vaporized steel pouring over all 4 sides of the building as the building's falling down. It's completely obvious when you realize exactly what trickery was pulled on us that day. Evil, but genius at the same time. And like Netanyahu said, it only took 350,000 tons of explosive, but you can do that in a 250-pound nuclear bomb. And nuclear bombs have been manufactured at Dimona in Israel. They've made over 600 nuclear bombs.
How many nuclear bombs have you seen go off there, Joe? And how have you verified that all of the contents that you assume were in the tower that turned to dust were there?
Steve, there would have just been too many people involved and too much time to take out. The building had to have been built with all of those, like you say, there's 50 elevators inside the building, and there was 110 floors. So there's
so the 5, elevators,
5,000 elevator doors in each one of those buildings. It had to have been
where are they? Where were they?
Get,
so they were all vaporized, Joe?
Yes. When you exceed the vaporization temperature of steel, then it doesn't matter whether it's stainless steel or carbon steel. When you exceed 5,200 degrees Fahrenheit, it turns to gas. And it leaves the site as a vapor. It's the same thing as boiling water out of a pot. You know, okay, you can melt water.
You're basing all of this on the assumption that that stuff was already there.
Nuclear bombs exist? Yeah, they do exist.
No, that this stuff was there. That the floors were all there. That the missing bolts were just coincidental. I mean, you're assuming that 220 acres of concrete floors existed at the time. How have you verified they were there at the time of destruction? You haven't. You can't. You have to take their word for it.
Steve, I don't want to suggest you've reached the point of absurdity, but you have reached the point of absurdity.
It's not absurd,
I like the fact that what you like to pay attention to details. Well, here's a detail you're not accounting for. Jet fuel or weak boats could not have ejected a 300-ton massive steel assembly upward and outward at a 45-degree angle and 600 feet into the Winter Garden, a point that Don Fox has made in the past. The building had to go somewhere. Your theory that it just was ready for collapse isn't tenable, even if every floor was bereft of all of the computers, the office furniture, and everything that make the distinction between a dead load and a live load. And I'm very troubled by your suggestion that the Israelis weren't involved in this. In fact, we had Israeli art students in both of the buildings. They were known as a gelatin group. They were even doing external performance art. I believe they were responsible for prepping the buildings, the facades, to create those impressions of planes having hit, though I don't thereby completely discount your idea of having used, in addition, some kind of missiles. But they were also involved, it appears, in planting jammers on buildings to block Port Authority dispatchers and first responders. They were planting explosives on the New Jersey side of the George Washington Bridge, where the cables are anchored, to collapse the bridge. There was an attempt of Israelis in these vans from the Mossad asset to explode a truck in the Lincoln Tunnel, another to explode a truck in the Holland Tunnel. There were trucks with demolition devices in specific parking areas of the Twin Towers. There's so much evidence here that you're leaving out, and the idea of exonerating Israel from involvement is preposterous. We even had, of course, the so-called dancing Israelis in Liberty State Park who are filming the destruction and making high fives and doing selfies. They were observed by a resident who thought this was suspicious activity.
Hey, do I get a chance to speak here? Can I get a chance?
Sure you do, Steve. Of
Thank
course,
you.
But you see,
okay, but listen, you just laid out a lot of stuff, Jim, that takes a lot of debunking to kick out here, okay? The gelatin thing, we've discussed this many times. Gelatin did not have the run of both towers. They only had the run of the 95th floor. They rented a helicopter and took photos of one guy standing outside the window, for which they built a back balcony on him for him to stand. Okay? Gelatin did not have the run of both towers. They were there allegedly in, 2000? And so you're saying that from 2000, in 2000, they planted bombs for the whole building. Gelatin also was out of Austria. They're not Israeli. They're Austrian. And as far as the mural van goes, the mural van was a debunked rumor long ago. I'll even quote Question, Mayor, do you know anything about the report about the possible resources they found in New Jersey? Giuliani, yes. I think the police commissioner was about to get information on that. Bernard Carrick, New York City Police Commissioner, quote, I got a confirmation from Chief of Detective. He's reached out to the FBI. They have confirmed that somebody has been stopped in New Jersey. 3 men in a van. However, there were no explosives in the van. All right? We're being held for questioning. They didn't know anything. All of those are rumors that were long since discredited.
Steve, this is very, very troubling to me because
it is, Jim, because you keep repeating the same stuff.
No, because you're giving us a lot of bullshit. This was urban moving systems. I even had a little old lady from Brooklyn call me up and explain how the rabbi had warned the members of the synagogue not to go into Lower Manhattan that day. Are you going to tell us that the United States didn't become involved in the Middle East and start taking out all the modern Arab states that served as a counterbalance after 9/11? That was the purpose and the intent of 9/11, that Wesley Clark was wrong when he told us at the Commonwealth Club that the whole plan was to take out the government of 7 countries in the next 5 years, beginning with Iraq and Libya.
I'm going to say, I'm just going to let the evidence lead where it will, Jim.
Steve, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry, but I think you've lost it.
I just let the evidence lead where
the project for the New American Century was written a year before 9/11 and said we needed a new Pearl Harbor, and then we'd be able to take out all of Israel's enemies in the Middle East. And read Christopher Boland's extensively footnoted 350-page long book, Solving 9/11. Watch the 45-minute video, 9/11 Solved, 9/11 Conspiracy Solved, Names, Connections, Details, on the Project Hammer, which was done to asset strip Russia, and those bonds were due on September 11th, and then the FEC said, well, we don't have to do anything. FCC said we don't have to do anything because we're going to shut down the markets for 4 days, and we're going to reset, and then all those previous bond issues will disappear. The economic cover-up is vast on this particular thing. The short selling of airlines and insurance company stock. There's so many things that prove preconditioning and the part of high connected bankers, and whether you want to connect them to a particular country or not is irrelevant. The problem is that this was a sophisticated, high-level criminal operation by some of the most powerful people on the planet who've never been held to account. And this is the closest we're getting to any public airing of all of these different issues. So I want to thank Rollie for hosting this show. But I'm like Jim, I can agree with you on a whole lot of things, and we've agreed on a whole lot of things tonight. But it's very disappointing that you can't accept multitude of facts on this. And we'll provide those facts so that other people can make their own independent judgments. We don't have to agree with anybody at this point. We've got plenty of evidence.
Do I get a chance to speak now?
Yes, go ahead.
The bottom-up foundation of the columns were still there. There was no nuclear demolition from the bottom up. The columns are still there. You can see them taking them out of the foundation footings. The melted stone was erosion from the ice age that you were describing. I never said the buildings were flimsy. I said they were probably built to be destroyed, and they could easily have been because the Port Authority doesn't answer to the public. And they could say whatever they wanted to say and get away with it because they don't answer to the public. They answer to 2 people on the planet, the governors of New York and New Jersey. They claim about the Israelis and the dancing Israelis. There's another one that is misrepresented. The Israelis, a lot of people like to think that the Jews own all the media and that they control the United States. But if that is the case, then they control all the media that tells us that the Jews control everything. Obviously, the Jews are dangled in our faces as Jewish lightning rods because the best way to discredit the Western public that has been indoctrinated since the 70s to equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism is by complaining about Jews. The best way to discredit the 9/11 truth movement in the eyes of the West that we need to reach in order to stop the wars is by bitching about Jews. And you mentioned, Christopher Bolin. All right, let's talk about Christopher Bolin. He has spread so much disinformation about 9/11. I can't believe you guys are even citing it. if anything, citing Christopher Bolin is a clue that you're on the total wrong track. Christopher Bolin has spread false information about everything from the molten steel to the gash at Shanksville. He has spread more lies about 9/11 than anybody, probably single-handedly, and you guys are citing him as the researcher of all get out. I swear, it's just
Steve,
no, listen. You guys have had your chance. You talk about the mural van. The mural van has been discredited for years. I can't believe you're still talking about that stuff.
Yet neither Joe nor I mentioned the word Jews. You brought that up. That's an obvious smear. You are playing the anti-Semitic card. That's a typical trick of Zionists. You appear to be a Zionist. Bullshit, indeed.
You talk about
evidence. Israel and the Mossad is the greatest practitioner of false flag attacks in the world. It's easily documentable.
Israel is the shield that the United States hides behind. Israel is the shield that the weak people hide behind because they can't see the reality of what occurred on 9/11. The United States launches missiles at themselves and blames it on Jews because it's easy to see that some people find it easier to blame Jews than it is to blame their own government.
Steve, you're embarrassing. You're just an embarrassment. I'm shocked at this. The whole thing was done up.
You get shocked. You get shocked every time. Oh yeah, you're self-indignant.
Steve, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. In my opinion, you have completely disgraced yourself here at the conclusion. It's very sad to see this.
You refuse to discuss the evidence that proves you wrong, and you will come up with any sort of excuse to blame Jews rather than examine the actual evidence. The physical evidence, the lateral impact of small projectiles at the World Trade Center is evidence that the U.S. military.
Okay, gentlemen, hold on.
Missiles were used at Shanksville. Missiles were used at Pentagon, but you guys are saying they nuked the World Trade Center. Yeah, they use different means at all different sites. That makes all kinds of sense.
Look. They use these Davy Crockett warheads. These were tactical artillery shells, nuclear shells that were sent back to Israel and refined and then brought back to the United States.
Oh, the Davy Crockett nuke. Davy Crockett, the one that's the faked video of the Davy Crockett warhead. That one.
You've already disgraced yourself enough, Steve.
You still won't discuss the laterally bent steel visible at the left sides of both towers that prove the U.S. military launched missiles at the World Trade Center. The Jews didn't do that. The U.S. military did.
Three of the dancing Israelis went back to Israel were on Israeli television.
Dancing Israelis. When were they there? When were they reported? The dancing Israelis were reported after the first impact. They were reported after the first impact when lots of people were videotaping the World Trade Center. They
went back to Israel and appeared on Israeli television.
And they said that they were there to record the event like lots of people were.
Prior knowledge. God.
No, not prior knowledge because they were not reported until after the first impact, Jim.
Joe,
they were reported after the first impact when lots of people were videotaping them. You're just fabricating Israel right and left.
Steve, what's been good about
evidence and ignoring the evidence that proves you're wrong. And you certainly will not address the impact at any of the sites. The lateral impacts in the steel are evidence that the military launched missiles at the World Trade Center. Period. Even that slightly damaged cladding at the very far left is evidence that missiles were used.
We had molten metal that was residual there and didn't cool down until the middle of December. There's no way that could have happened except from extraordinarily high temperatures of the kind associated with nuclear events.
The way it happened is they lied. The media are owned by the government, Jim,
Steve,
and they're lying. That's how it happened.
I agree. Someone's lying, Steve. I agree. Someone's lying here. Someone's lying here on this program tonight.
Did Israel video?
You are embarrassing.
Did Israel visit?
You say it all the time.
Did Israel video record
psychological projection?
Listen to Joe. Listen to Joe, Steve.
Did Israel?
Why should I listen to Joe?
Did Israel videotape
Why should
the
anyone
attack
listen
on the
to you,
USS
for
Liberty?
Christ's sake? Go ahead, Joe.
Did Israel videotape the attack on the USS Liberty so we can find out who really did that?
I don't know.
How about the Levant affair? How about the King David Hotel?
What does that have to do with the evidence?
Okay, you've got a nation that was created by terrorists, that's been run by terrorists.
Evidence that leads a lot closer to home than some shitty.
The Mossad has a history of false flag attacks. Israel was
what
built on
does any of this
attacks.
have to do with the evidence that leads
it's
to
the kind of attack that Israel did? Their origin began in a Jerusalem conference where Bibi Netanyahu published a book.
How does this verify that the towers were fully occupied? How does this explain how the gashes were cut? How does this explain what cut the hole in that field? And
Steve, you can't even explain where the building went for crying out loud.
Well, I certainly can. I certainly can, Jim, because there's photographic evidence of it that you won't touch. You won't touch the evidence of the dust pouring out of the towers. You won't touch the evidence of the laterally bent steel, and you won't touch the evidence that proves the towers were dismantled.
Yeah, where did they go then?
1,350-foot tall cardboard boxes full of dust. Sorry, Steve. That's why we called you Hollowhead 2 years ago when you first brought this stuff up. We've tried to be reasonable with you.
It's just evidence, Joe. You don't have to like it. It's just evidence. You don't have to like it.
It's not evidence. It's a fantasy. You're fantasy, spinning a fantasy.
If it's not evidence, then you would try to explain it, Jim. You can't even try. You just skirt right over it and ignore it like it didn't exist.
You are
I've told you all of this stuff before, but you pretend like you've never heard it. You just carry on like it never happened.
Hey, gentlemen, can we open up the phone lines real quick? Is that okay with us?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. All right, we got callers that have been waiting patiently. So we got Connecticut. Do you want to jump in the lion's den with us?
Well, yeah, this
Ask
is
your
Wayne.
question, Connecticut. Yeah,
Can you hear me?
What's your name and moniker?
Yeah, well, my name is. You guys know me. I'm Wayne Costi. So I actually have been listening to this, and it's pretty. I should say, just disturbing to listen to the conflict. But here's my question: for those who say that there were no planes, how do you explain this tower sway at the website 9/11 Truth Outreach or 911tap.org? You can see an article that talks about the tower sway of after the impact. That can't be explained by explosives simply because you'd have to see a huge ejection of material to one side or the other, but it's not there. So there's tower sway that can only be done by a large momentum impact, and that is seen both on the South Tower with UA 175 and the North Tower in the Wolfgang style videos, in which the tower is seen to move the appropriate diameter of the antenna. So how do you explain this if there's no planes at the towers? Over.
Well, I don't know if this is supposed to be for me. Look, all these claims about the plane, it's like throwing an empty beer can against a brick wall. The equal and opposite reactions. Newton's laws show that the effect of a 100-ton airliner on a 500,000-ton building, when the building is stationary and the plane is in motion, would be the same as if the plane were stationary and the building were in motion, hitting it at the same speed. It would have decimated the plane. I don't believe there was any sway. If there was it would seem to me to be artificially introduced in the videos. I'm not convinced at all there would have been no physical reason for there to have been any sway. Any real plane would have crumpled external to the building and falling to the ground, and we know it didn't happen. There would have had to be body, seats, luggage, wings, tail on the ground. We have video from the ground. They were not there. There was an engine at Church and Murray that turns out to have been planted. Jack White discovered in Fox News footage that 4 or 5 guys in FBI vests were unloading something heavy and putting it there. It was an antiquated engine from a 767. It was underneath a steel scaffolding, underneath a canopy. There was no damage to the sidewalk.
We're talking about this.
There would have been no need to plant an engine if there had been real planes.
Sway of the building, Jim. Sway of the building. We're talking about the sway of the building. It's been recorded in videos of the South Tower and the North Tower.
There were no plane hit the building. I've explained to you it was physically impossible for the plane to have hit the building and not crumpled external to the building. We would have had evidence beneath the building, body seats and luggage. I thought, Wayne, you're just making this up. I'm sorry to say. I don't believe there was any sway. And if there'd been real planes, why would they have had to plant a phony engine at Church and Murray? It's because there wasn't any plane. They planted some phony footage, and they counted on people like you to promote the idea that there was a sway. There wouldn't have been any sway. It would have been like throwing an empty beer can at a brick wall. That's the equivalent.
And where it broke, as it was pointed out by, I think it was Steve, at the bolts. If you take a look at the pictures of the damage that were taken by multiple photos, and in real time, you'll see that they're broken at the bolts between those perimeter column sections. The bolts are what failed. You can see clearly when they broke.
It's obviously, look, it was aerodynamically impossible for a 767 at that altitude be flying at the speed that's shown in the videos, all right?
It's coming,
the Marine Corps and the British Air Force. No, I'm telling you, it was physically impossible. Wait,
no, it's not.
You like to make up a lot of stuff. Read John.
I don't have to read Lear's stuff.
No, well, I don't have to listen to you because John knows what he's talking about, and you're making it up. I'm sorry. That's how I feel about what you're saying here and now.
There is sway.
That's just silly. Okay. It's just silly. It's much easier.
Okay, gentlemen.
It's just much easier to introduce a fake sway than it is for a real plane to have hit the building. It's ridiculous.
Steve, do you have anything to say about Wayne's question?
About the sway? Yeah, I have seen the videos of it, and I gotta say I think they're tampered with. I do. I saw the sway. It seemed to sway even down to the base of the tower, and that just seems impossible to me. So I do tend to think that Jim's probably right there. They're probably tampered with.
And hey, I agree with Jim and Steve.
Why don't we just give final thoughts, because it looks like we're almost done here for tonight. Jim, do you have a final thought for us?
Well, I appreciate the strenuous exchange. I think Steve's a real smart guy. I think he makes a lot of good points. I believe his most gross miscalculation here is to ignore the proper political motivation. Who benefits? What could be more important than solving a crime? I simply reiterate that if you want to see the videos, the photographs that substantiate the points I've been making, go to BitChute. It's 9/11, who was responsible and why, with 130 videos, and also the book, America Nuked on 9/11, Compliments of the CIA, the neocons in the Department of Defense, and the Mossad, with 15 contributors. And just pick it up from there and carry on your investigation. I appreciate his and Joe's participation tonight, notwithstanding our differences, however strenuous they may have been.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Joe, go ahead and go ahead, Steve. Give your final thought. Go ahead.
You first, Joe.
Yeah. Like I said, I've put over 1,000 hours of research into just mainly the World Trade Center 1 and 2. I recommend that you read Ground Zero: Nuclear Demolition of the World Trade Center Building by William Cahill. Then one of the other things I read was Nuclear Weapon Employment Doctrine, which is Field Manual 101-31-1, Fourth Generation of Nuclear Weapons, Military Effectiveness and Collateral Effects by Andre Gosper, which is a several hundred-page long book. And then I read all of the 80 articles that are posted on nuclear education at the Veterans Today site, and they go through this thing in excruciating detail. And I'd already studied nuclear reactors and nuclear bombs and nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers. And so I'm very familiar with nuclear and also natural nuclear fission as part of the 100 articles that I've had published at hundreds of websites on climate change. So I'm very familiar with the natural fission processes and also the man-made fission processes. And I encourage people to do their own self-study, but the evidence is overwhelming. I think the nuclear education at Veterans Today is premier work and explains far more than we could possibly discuss in a couple of hours. But I appreciate you guys' time. Thanks a whole bunch.
Well, let's see. My closing comments, I'd like to just remind everybody that the best way to control the opposition is by leading it. Therefore, all the leading hypotheses of the truth movement should be given extra scrutiny. And I think that if you really want to find the truth for 9/11, you're going to have to do the work for yourself. And I would recommend that you don't take anybody's word for anything, not mine, not Jim's, not Joe's, and start by examining the evidence at the scene of the crime, and it'll add up pretty quickly. It boils down to missiles. Thanks for everything. Thanks for the exchange. As usual, Jim, always appreciated. Good to talk to you too, Joe. Thanks again, Rollie. Good night, everyone.
Steve. A pleasure.
It was fun.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. And thank you. I'm Rollie Quaid, and we'll be back. Have a good night, everybody.
How to invent a religion.
I always knew you had to be willing to die to even do this job.
Can't stop what's coming. Executive orders.
The creation and the maintenance of a secret government within our government.
Is something wrong? With what? With anything?
I feel like you want to rip your face off.
There's something wrong with everything.
I was so spun.
What's the most you ever lost in the coin toss?
The law of the jungle, sir.
The most you ever lost in the coin toss?
You don't know what you're talking about.
Who said it? I said it. You don't know what you're talking about.
Suppression of unrest and dissent. Domestic anti-terrorism.
I don't have some way to put it.